Welcome to the Pantry podcast, where I have conversations about meal planning, food, and wellness to help you save time in the kitchen, reduce your grocery bill, stress less about food, and delight in dinner time. Hello, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Pantry podcast. We are starting off this year with a great interview from Kimberley Gillan. She is a food security expert and author of a book called How Low Can You Go? Nutritious Meals from $50 a Week. So this book obviously is all about food budgeting, how you can maximize your food budget. And today, the bulk of our conversation is about maximizing your food budget, some tips and tricks for grocery shopping specifically, for meal planning. Kimberly has so much great information to share about how to combat the rising cost of food. So she has her own personal story about unfortunately getting cancer and then having to stop working and, struggling with how much food that they could buy in their household. So she has personal experience with, having to be a really savvy shopper at the grocery store. And she shares so much of that knowledge on this podcast today. We have a lot to discuss. So without further ado, here is my interview. Hi, Kimberly. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Why don't we just start by having you say who you are and what you do?
My name's Kimberley Gillan, and I wrote a book which was released earlier this year called How Low Can You Go? Nutritious Meals from $50 a Week. This is the second edition that was based almost entirely on my first edition, which was $30 Australian a week, but I have now made it for a global audience. And so while the prices have not radically changed, I needed to allow for the regional variations across the world. This book is very different to any book that's out there, and it came very much out of my own experience. I was studying and working in the field of food security, particularly in poor rural communities, when I was diagnosed with cancer in 2016 and almost immediately had to stop work. And at that time, I was earning 70% of our income, of our joint income in our household. And we had the year before borrowed the maximum amount on a mortgage. So we had to go through some radical changes in our household. And I was able to lean into my own professional background. And cut a long story short, we got through that period. We held on to our house. We had teenage kids at the time. They got through and both of them went on to university. So in 2023, I looked at the situation with rising food costs, rising costs of living, both here in Australia and around the world, and thought, could I do it today? It's tougher today. Would we still have been able to hold on to the house? And from that, I sat down. It was a question that just wouldn't let me go. And I sat down and I started researching, and I came up with a very different approach to how to budget, do your shopping lists, your meal plans, and so forth, to have a good life on about 40% of what most people are currently spending.
Wow. Well, it's certainly applicable to the rise of food costs that we've all experienced in the last few years. So I think that that's awesome that you tried it for yourself and then did the research to kind of back it up. And I definitely want to get into more of the practicality of that eating on a budget. But I'm curious a little bit more about your research into the food security and food insecurity. And does that look, I mean, you said you were doing that based off of rural communities, but does that look similar around the world, rural food insecurity, or are there specific areas where that is more of an issue, a different issue? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ronnie. I think if my own research and what I've, gleaned from looking at organizations such as WHO is that we have a kind of a two stories simultaneously unfolding. And there's the story that most of us are familiar with people in developing or struggling countries where you've got starvation, quite literal starvation. And a lot of work has been done in that area. And we've had some gains over the last decade. But simultaneously, there's increasing unrest in a lot of these, I struggle to call them third world countries. But the part that interests me, my own area, is what is happening in wealthy countries,
Mm.
such as the USA, Canada, UK, Australia. And I think it's what we're dealing with is a hidden malnutrition in these countries. We've seen the cost of living continue to rise. And if you're on a low income, like I have been and I still am, if you get a big bill, the only place that you've got any discretion, any wiggle room at all is your food budget, so that tends to be what gets hit first. And so it's very easy for us to lean into convenience, cheap carbohydrates, the instant noodles or ramen noodles, filling the plate with rice or other simple carbohydrates and thinking, well, I'm okay because my belly is full. In fact, over time on a diet like this, you'll put on weight. Most of us will. But yet, what it doesn't show is that statistically, in America, for example, we're looking at least 1 in 5 having some form of malnutrition, 1 person in 5.
Mm.
And this is a really big impact on that individual, their families, and, in terms of our ability to live out our potential. So, because when you've got hidden malnutrition, you're frequently tired, you pick up illness more easily, you could be fuzzy headed. These can be symptoms of other things. But if you're looking at a situation where you are on an extended basis, not covering the broad range of nutrition you need, then the risk of malnutrition, this hidden malnutrition, is quite high.
That's a really good point that you make, that our food budget is really often the place where we do have the most wiggle room, because we can't control how much our mortgage is, or we can try to keep the lights turned off and stuff, but still your electric bill is going to be a certain amount every single month anyways. So that's a really good point to make. I guess I hadn't really fully made that connection until you said that. When I think about how can I spend the least amount of money at the grocery store, the first thing that often comes to my mind is, well, we'll just eat ramen. I feel like
Mm,
that's kind of like the college kid mindset, of like, how am
yes.
I going to eat for as cheaply as possible? We're just going to eat the, $1 packets of ramen and we'll survive. But you're right. There is a compounding issue that comes with that, particularly if it's not just uh, a temporary solution to something. So I feel like you're getting to the point where you're trying to point out that maybe there's some misconceptions about eating on a budget. So like, I don't have to eat ramen all the time. What are
No.
what are some of those other misconceptions about it?
Okay. I think that my approach with the book was that you start with the most cost-effective nutrition, meeting all of your basic daily nutrient requirements according to Western dietary regulations, which are all very, very similar, by the way. So you start with that. So you go, okay, I've got to be as cost effective as possible because, of course, big part of my background is economics. So I was just looking for the best bang for my buck. Um, So I started with those ingredients, and that's a very different approach to what is normally done. A budget meal, they'll often go, oh, let's lean into the pasta, which, by the
Mm.
way, if you're going to look at a cheap carbohydrate, pasta is probably still the cheapest, more so than ramen noodles. But the idea is you don't just fill your plate with pasta. You've got to actually go, well, if I'm comparing my carbohydrates, you know, ramen noodles, pasta, rice, potatoes, which of those is going to give me the best bang for my buck? And the resounding answer is potatoes. If I could just get people on low incomes to recognize the value of potatoes when you're going through tough times rather than instant noodles or ramen noodles, that's a big step forward.
Wow, I like that. You said that a lot, actually. I feel like I read in a book earlier this year about the like satiety signals that our body sends us, and actually
Mm.
potatoes, if like they were just comparing different foods, like if somebody eats something first thing in the morning, what are the foods that make them feel full for the longest? And potatoes was the top of the list. Like, maybe we don't necessarily want to eat just a potato for breakfast.
No,
Hash browns are maybe better, but yeah, that actually ranked at the highest for satiety. So it's really interesting that it's also something that's a really good bang for your buck, and there's an added benefit on top of that that it's going to keep you full for longer.
that's right. Some of the most recent studies, and I think anyone who's interested in food will have seen these as well, has been that, this cycle of dieting and going on low calorie, low carb diets can often lead to weight gain. And it's because there's a theory now that it's because the body is saying, I am being starved of the nutrition that I need. So, yes, you should, if you need to lose weight, look at the amount of food that you're eating, but you still need to cover the broad range of nutrition you need. And potatoes is one of those foods that ticks a whole lot of boxes, covers a lot of nutrition. It's, as you said, it's filling. And there's just so many different ways that you can cook and use potatoes. So there can remain some variety.
Mm. And so, related to potatoes, just kind of in a practical sense, are there other fresh produce staples that you encourage people to buy because they're a better nutritional bang for your buck?
Yes, this brings to mind first I want to talk about fresh produce, coming at it from an economics and food security point of view. In my approach, I look at what's the best, most nutrient dense foods, and
Mm.
often they are the dehydrated produce.
Mm.
So no, there's still going to be fresh produce. You should always have access to fresh produce. But as we deal with food security, which is going to be a continuing and increasing problem, it's going to affect fresh produce most of all. So your dairy, your meats, your fresh meats, your fresh fruits and vegetables are most vulnerable to volatility from prices going up and down.
Mm.
And that's to do with climate change, unsustainable farming practices, political unrest around the world that impacting supply chains. There's all sorts of reasons. There's numerous compounding reasons why fresh produce is something you should have, but if
Mm.
you have to, you can do without. And I say this to people who are on the lowest incomes, lean into your dehydrated foods. But in terms of fresh produce, I think things like your dark green leafies, particularly kale,
Mm.
and we call it silver beet, and I can never remember what you guys call it. Anyway, the dark green leafy vegetables,
Mhm.
not so much spinach unless it's frozen, because it loses its nutrition every day from the day it was picked. So unless you've got new spinach growing in your garden, I'm less inclined towards purchasing spinach from the supermarket. So frozen peas are brilliant, and they're great. In fact, mixed frozen vegetables are another great way to fill your plate and will cover a vast amount of nutrition. We've been sold that fresh is best, and yet when you look at nutrient density and food composition tables, what you see again and again is that the snap frozen or the dehydrated will often be more effective in capturing that nutrition. Where fresh produce is really good is it's just good for the gut biota. So you still want to have as much fresh produce as you can afford. Carrots are another one. Very nutrient dense, cheap. So yeah, we use carrots often in place of fruit.
Mm.
So carrot sticks with dip for morning tea for the kids, that sort of thing.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great tip. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the dehydrated foods because nothing is coming at first to mind about I mean, I guess I can think of like dehydrated milk, but can you use
Hmm.
some recommendations for some dehydrated foods that you're thinking of?
Yes, above all, your pulses, which is garbanzo beans or chickpeas.
Mm.
Honestly, anyone who has a look at this book will have a whole new appreciation for chickpeas. They've actually been identified by the World Health Organization as being possibly one of the most important foods for helping us with food security in the future. So, yes, chickpeas, lentils, split peas, the and all of these are in the dehydrated form, in
Mhm.
the kilogram packets, preferably that you can get, or, I don't know the sizing in the USA, but those larger packets. And some of the advantages of going for those dehydrated forms is the vast array of things that they can do, and you can keep dipping into them. A can that costs you $1 of chickpeas, that have been rehydrated in the can, that is the equivalent of about 10 cents worth of the dehydrated form. It just needs to be rehydrated. And the great thing about them is that you can, from chickpeas, you can make your own sprouts. You can roast them and have a coffee alternative. And you can make aquafaba, which is an egg replacement.
Mm.
That so I really encourage those sorts of dehydrated. I also talk a lot in the book about uh, dehydrated skim milk powder, and I know a lot of people don't like the taste of it. I actually use it in cooking.
Mm.
I find it very effective in cooking, and perhaps because we're mammals, there's just so much in skim milk powder that covers our nutrition, a broad range of nutrition. In
Mm.
fact, that's one of the reasons it's the basis of so many protein shakes. So a great way to start the day if you're busy is to have make your own protein shake mix. And this works fine so long as you don't have lactose intolerance. And a lot of people of Anglo-Saxon Celtic background do have some form of lactose intolerance.
Mm. It's a great point that you're making about, your can of beans versus a bag of dehydrated beans is such a difference in money savings. And also, if you think about it, it's a good, environmental choice as well, because then you don't have all of those cans and things that you're recycling or
Mm.
throwing away. You're able to kind of reduce the amount of bulk that you have in that sort of a way.
I was just going to say it does require pre-soaking, but if you're someone who's not organized, then, for me, I'm just in the habit of putting those chickpeas or full lentils or whatever in a pre-soak. But the split versions, your split peas, your split red lentils, they don't require pre-soaking. So
Mm.
yeah, even if you start with those simpler and start leaning into those and bulking out some of your meals with those, that is a real huge nutrition boost. And you can make things with a combination of, say, sweet potatoes and split red lentils that are really, really good for you and such a low cost.
Mm. That sounds delicious this time of the year. In the United States, this time of the year, getting cold weather, that sounds really nice too.
Mm. Goes well with pumpkin as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me into what I also wanted to talk a little bit about, which is kind of, doing some meal planning and some preparation as a benefit to your budget. You just mentioned like maybe you're not somebody who is super organized, and so you don't always remember to soak your beans. But I'm just interested in some of maybe your ideas around how planning also is going to benefit the cost of your food budget.
I think that meal planning, and that means right from looking at what you've already got in the cupboard as the basis for the meals you're going to make this week, and then sitting down and writing that shopping list at home, thinking it through, having that bigger picture thinking to help you stick to your budget. It, I think if I was to pick one thing that makes the biggest single difference, it's meal planning.
Mm.
So I'm a prepper from way back in terms of meal prepping on a Sunday afternoon. I enjoy it and I'm quite used to it now. And I find that through the week, I'm less inclined to cook anyway. If I feel like it, I've got options there that I can make a meal from scratch. But I find it really nice to go, oh, that's right. We're having curry tonight.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we are obviously big fans of meal planning around here, and it is so interesting. Just the simple act of meal planning can save a lot of money. And also being intentional on top of that about your meal planning. And
Yeah.
like you said, looking at home, seeing what you have, how can you kind of put together a menu from things that you have and then not buy as much at the grocery store, and also not buying doubles of things because you already have them. Having a little bit of intentionality with the meal plan can make a huge difference in the amount of money that you actually end up spending at the grocery store week to week, or month to month if you happen to shop for longer periods of time. And I'm curious, you mentioned, buying the larger packets of dehydrated lentils and beans. Do you have any other food that you really recommend buying in bulk that you feel like stores well and is pretty versatile for making in multiple recipes?
Beyond having your pulses and a broad range of them and skim milk powder, which we've already discussed, I would, and of course, potatoes, as we've also discussed, that even as a single person, if you know how to store potatoes and you buy them unpeeled or unwashed, they will keep for months. So those are the items and of course, I will get, your grains, and oats also. Oats is something that I will buy in bulk if I can. Even here, we tend to get them in kilogram packets. You don't tend to get them in larger sizes, but I would if I could get a discount on it. Rice, once we've got past those items, I consider my pantry to be fairly well stocked, a few sauces, herbs and spices. So that tends to be it. I really think let's put it this way, if I was going into the supermarket and another pandemic has been declared and everyone else is racing up to the toilet paper, I'd be heading to the pulses first. I'd be
Mm.
stocking up on pulses. So yeah, chickpeas, lentils, that sort of thing.
Mm. Yeah, now certainly adding lentils and beans and everything into your diet does help boost the protein content and everything of your meals, but I feel like the most expensive place at the grocery store is usually the fresh meat section.
Yes.
So, what kind of recommendations do you have around fresh meat and how you can use it in your plan to still maximize your budget?
Okay, there's quite a few points here, and this is great because I don't normally get to talk about this. With meat, firstly, chicken. I've done extensive trials on which is the cheapest way just to get chicken meat. And believe it or not, it's not chicken breasts or chicken Maryland, it's chicken drumsticks. Even if all that you want is the meat and you don't care about the rest of it, the best way to the most highest percentage of meat for the lowest cost is chicken drumsticks. And then having said that, it's very easy for you to put the bones aside. You've taken the meat, you've removed the skin and the bone and the gristle, you've taken the meat, you've cooked with the meat, store those bones in the freezer, or simultaneously make yourself a chicken stock. And
Mm.
that chicken stock will make some of the best meals you can have, and it will
Hmm.
certainly create more flavor for your rice or pasta or gravies. Put my chicken stock, I pour it into ice cube trays, and then once it's frozen, transfer it to a freezer safe container. And it's just so handy to be able to take a cube of real chicken stock and use that in cooking. So, um, yes, but even if you didn't want to do that, getting your chicken meat from drumsticks is the most cost-effective way. And another reason why is it's a richer flavor too. The meat from the chicken on the leg has a more intense flavor.
Mm.
And that brings me to red meat. My advice is I encourage you to look for those richer, meatier cuts of meat and then extend them out with lentils or other pulses to give you the protein. You want for example, a lamb shank, one lamb shank, very, very rich flavor and expensive to buy these days. But if you can pad it out with barley and green lentils, which kind of works with the flavor of the lamb, then you can make that one lamb shank go a family 2 meals in a casserole. So I do look at richer cuts of meat, even though they can be more expensive these days, but I extend them. And
Mm.
this, of course, is something that our great grandparents did through the Depression. I think we've all got to learn to make do. We've got to get back to being more savvy with making those cuts of meat go further.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like a lot of what I'm hearing from your tips is that just investing a little bit more time into your food
Mm.
is really going to help save quite a bit of money. A lot of the foods that are more expensive at the grocery store are more expensive because they're convenient. And
Yes,
just expending a little bit more time, as our grandparents may have done with their food, is really the thing that makes it more financially beneficial for you.
that's right. Yes. I talk about making do, and I think that the real heroes of this coming decade will be those who will take what looks like a very strange mix of ingredients and make them work. An example of that is tinned sardines. I didn't grow up with tinned sardines, and at first they were very challenging for me, but they are literally the cheapest form of calcium that you can get.
Mm.
And they're also brilliant for B12 and zinc and so many other key ingredients. In fact, all of your small boned tinned fish are something that we should lean into more. But finding a way that I could make this work for my family, that is challenging. But this is what making do is all about.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you bring something like that up, because I am curious if you have advice for parents and maybe who have children who are a little bit pickier when it comes to eating, or maybe you're trying to, if you're cutting back on your grocery budget and that does require you to buy foods that maybe you previously had not purchased, how do you involve your family or I guess, like get your family acquainted with these new foods?
I think, and I encourage in the book that you have a family conference. Your children deserve to know that we're going to start doing things differently now. And I think part of that journey is that you start talking to your partner and the kids about the connection between what they eat and what it's doing for them.
Mm.
That can help a lot. For example, when I had to switch from giving my kids fresh fruit for morning school lunches for morning tea to carrot sticks, I said to them, do you know that eating more raw carrots is really good for your eyesight? There's, a science that says it increases your night vision. So my kids were really excited at the idea that they might be developing superpowers. So they wanted to keep testing to see if it worked. And it may or may not work. That's the beauty of science. But I could lean into the science as part of my explanation rather than, oh, we can't afford those apples that we used to buy anymore.
Mm.
That was a better way to go. And it was also the truth. I was going, okay, what is the most cost-effective way to give them the nutrient they need? And I also think that we can borrow from the fast food chains and we can learn a little bit about what makes their food fun. And
Mm.
I encourage people who are going through tough times to have these rituals. Like, you might not be able to go out to a restaurant on a Friday night, but you can still eat out every Friday night. Take some finger food to the park or the beach or the lake, or kick a football around, make it about having fun. And on those nights, we would do finger food, which was, you know, I used a lot of crumbed goods because there's a lot of goodness actually in breadcrumbs. It can be high in salt, but it's also high in folate. So basically, you are finding ways to improve the texture of the food, make it easy to eat, create a dipping sauce. So I would do one of my recipes was a chickpea nugget, and it looked very much like chicken nuggets. And of course, it was provided with a dipping sauce. And we would take that out. We'd go to the park or whatever. So yeah, that these are the things that you can do that will help with fussy eaters. But above all, I think we owe it to our kids to start educating them about what the different foods do for them so that when they're out on their own in their later years, they understand that living on instant noodles is not a good idea.
Yeah. If you brought up two really important things there, one of which is just like you said, including your kids in this conversation and not having them be separate from what's going on in your households. Because particularly when it comes to food, uh, they also are eating 3 times a day or, more if they're a
Mm.
teenager. And that I think
Yes.
that's a really important learning moment and teaching moment, but also just maybe family connection moment as well to just be like, we're doing this together. Maybe you also explain the reasons why this is important for your family right now. And I think that that's great for kids, especially older kids, teenagers and older to realize that, sometimes you struggle and that there's solutions that you can implement so that it doesn't feel so hard or so challenging. That's a really great teaching moment. And
Yeah.
I also love that you brought up the fun aspect of it because I think that there's a tendency for eating on a budget to feel like a punishment for not being able to afford certain foods or to be able to afford to go out to eat. And so I love that you brought up keeping it fun still because I really do for me, cooking is such a source of fun and creativity in my day, And I think that other people can hopefully gain that as well. Home cooked meals don't have to be a negative thing. It could be a really positive, wonderful thing in your life and in your family.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the biggest moments of learning for me out of that period when we were financially with our backs against the wall was that it was going to be even more important that we have fun,
Mm,
that we reach out and be there for each other, that we have these rituals where we take the meal out of the house, where we have a date night that, that me and my husband, make sure those things happen. They're even more important if you are going through a stressful period. And yeah, I actually have in the meal plans for how low can you go, I have desserts twice a week. But these are often old-fashioned desserts that still have some nutritional value. It's the modern processed dessert choices that gets you into the most trouble. But,
mm,
an old-fashioned cake with custard, that just to me, that's me showing love to my family and
mm,
making an ordinary meal a little bit more special. It'll also do wonders to get them to eat the main course if they're still getting used to this change in diet. Having that chocolate cake, which is fairly simply made and not a lot of sugar, with a bit of custard can really help to lighten things up, and kids get a real kick out of that, and
mm,
so do husbands. I believe that it's more important than ever that you just celebrate being together.
mm. So having been through that situation yourself and feeling overwhelmed by the cost of food, what I mean, you already just gave a few tips, but do you have any other additional advice for people or families who are currently feeling overwhelmed by the cost of inflation and, the grocery budget maybe being twice as much as they were used to it being a couple years ago?
Okay, first I'm going to make them feel even more overwhelmed. S The science is buckle in. This is only going to get worse. We're
Mm,
going to see continuing food price rises. So even people on middle incomes across the world, they're already feeling the pinch, and it's going to get worse. So if you're on a high income, you can continue to shop the way you do today. If you're on a middle or lower income, you do need a plan B. And I do believe that on top of everything else that I've said, shop weekly, but think 5 weekly. And the
mm,
reason I say this is there tends to be with supermarket psychology this tendency to put things on a cyclical discount. I find this a lot with shelf stable foods like coffee. You know yourself, every so often it seems to come up on special as a discount. I call these the regular discounts. So if you learn to shop 5 week, like shop every week, but have a percentage of your budget for any item that you know you're going to need in the next 5 weeks, that is going to help you get ahead. And
mm,
I create a rotating 5 week shopping list. So I return to week one after week five. And this helps me get further and further and further in front because every time I buy, for example, the coffee at a discounted price, and I buy enough to see me for that 5 weeks, knowing that the odds are I'm going to get to buy it at a discounted rate again, roughly this time again in that 5 week cycle, then that gives me more money to put towards something else that becomes discounted next week. And you get to the point where you are having more and more of your shopping items
Mm.
at a discounted price. That can make a huge difference as well.
I like that. That sounds like a really genius, I guess, way of organizing your shopping list. I think it can be really easy to get caught up kind of in the week to week, not really putting very much effort into looking out a little further or buying things on sale more at random rather than buying them with a plan. I feel like
Yeah,
that's a
that's
trap that
right.
I often fall into that trap of like, oh, this is on sale. I know I use this thing, but there's not really an expectation for what I'm going to do with it or how long, like in what time frame I'm going to use it. So I really like that 5 week
I,
plan that you have.
I think it's important too to have that something like a 5 week plan. I wouldn't stretch it any more than 8 weeks. And the reason for that is that you you can run the risk of spending money to save money without any real idea of when you're going to use it. So by having a fairly loose and flexible set of shopping lists that circulate over a 5 week period, you are putting yourself into a position where you say, oh, goodness, lamb's on special this week. I will purchase that as my meat for this 5 week period because the discount's really good. But
Mm,
I'm not going to buy so much that I don't have a clear concept of when I'm going to use it.
mhm,
We've all got things in the cupboard that we bought with the best of intention that we haven't got around to using, and that's what you want to avoid as well.
mhm. So you mentioned that your book has meal plans in it. I'm curious if you can give us just a quick rundown of how your book is laid out. What else is in there besides meal plans?
Okay, I start because food is not one size fits all. I start with a scenario for someone who's young, living in the inner city, and I call it the bachelor plan, and they just want really simple fixes. I've used this with my son, and the idea is that we need to start training our, in my case, my children, how to bulk cook and the importance of batch cooking and meal prepping, but doing it in such a way that it's not too time consuming, particularly for university students or people who have just moved out for the first time. So this is a plan which leans into really simple food prepping for the beginner. And, it's like 2 hours a fortnight, and
Mm,
it sets you up for most, but not all of your meals. Then I look at what's called the hardcore plan, and this is the cheapest way that you can go. It literally answers the question of what are the best foods, and let's work with those. So, and of course, the best foods are those that are the cheapest, but cheapest for that nutrition that, in terms of covering your nutrition. That is a plan that has, in Australia, $30 for per person per week. It covers all of your nutrition, and it involves about 3 hours per week for a family of four in food prep, and it makes a huge difference. And that includes food prep, believe it or not, for breakfasts and lunches.
mm,
There's things such as a Italian rice slice. You'll notice that sandwiches don't factor in any of my food prep plans. You can do better than sandwiches.
mhm,
Um, and sandwiches are actually quite time consuming. So I like the idea of a rice slice where the Italian rice slice can be eaten cold, but it's got a lot of vegetables in it, and it can be quite filling. So yeah, and then of course we've got evening meals that are prepped as well. And then finally we've got the savvy strategy, which is where we've covered You've learned a lot from both the earlier plans and you start to put together your own plan. There's also quite a bit of information on supermarket psychology, how to recognize where the best foods will be in your supermarket and the traps, the marketing traps that have been set up and how to deal with them. And there's also a section on saving money on Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, and also stocking up for emergencies. If you live in an area where you, as I do, have things such as hurricanes or cyclones or bushfires to deal with.
Wow, that is so much. I feel like you really cover the wide range of possibilities for different demographics of people, who need this kind of information or even just want to make some small changes. Sounds like
Yeah,
you have opportunities for pretty much everybody to learn something in there. That's amazing.
thank you. Yes.
Well, let's before we wrap up, why don't you remind everybody again the name of your book and where they can buy it, and if you have any place online where they can connect with you and learn a little bit more about you.
Thank you, Ronnie. The book is How Low Can You Go? Nutritious Meals from $50 per person per week. It is available on Amazon. You can also order it through a bookstore through Ingram Sparks. And it is, and you can also find out more information through my website, which is kimberleygillan.com. And just keep in mind that it's Kimberley spelt with Ley. There is actually an Australian journalist in Sydney that does budgeting generally. So, and her name's Kimberley Gillan with an Ly. So, yeah, it's fairly easy to find, and there's nothing else out there that addresses this from a food security minimum amount of spend. And for most of us, it's going to be a 60% saving on what they're currently spending now on groceries.
Well, I hope everybody checks it out and learns more, because it sounds like you have so much more information to share than what we were just able to cover in this podcast. So thank you so much for joining me today, Kimberly. It's been really nice talking to you.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. As always, there are links in the show notes for Kimberly's website, as well as where to find her book, so that you can learn a little bit more about her and what she does, and maybe pick up a copy of her book and start saving some money at the grocery store. If you like the Plan to Eat podcast, the best way you can support us is by sharing this episode with a friend or giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you again in 2 weeks.